The alternative view, which Gerry McCann says was put to him by the police, is that the abductor was already in the flat hiding when Gerry McCann did his checks.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're getting to the core of the McCann case, which is something you won't easily find in the media narrative. You will virtually never hear the McCanns talking about it. You will never hear any people close to the McCanns ever mentioning the Smith sighting. In this episode, we're going to go through what Kate refers to in terms of acknowledging the Smith sighting, or rather not acknowledging it, in her book. And then we're going to juxtapose that with what the former lead detective, the detective taken off the case, said about the Smith sighting. And that'll probably be the one episode on the subject. And then we'll do a follow-up looking at Netflix, the media narrative, the police narrative, and then finally what Martin Smith and his companions said about what they saw on the night of May 3rd, shortly before 10 o'clock that night, and then the strange twists and turns around Martin Smith saying what he saw, repeating what he saw, and then what ultimately happened to his story. Right? We're going to deal with that across the span of 2 episodes. So if you're interested in particular the coverage of the Smith sighting and how it relates to the McCann case, please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, the fascinating insight in terms of the media narrative, which I'm not really going to deal with in this episode, is when the Sunday Times published an article about EFITs based on the Smith sighting, and they kind of were saying that, or basically accusing someone, I'm not going to say who, they accused someone of suppressing the information. The Sunday Times were promptly sued. So as the information emerged that there was another sighting and there's an alternative to the Tannerman sighting, right? As that information emerged, the newspaper that published that was sued. And so, and the accusation made by that newspaper, the Sunday Times, was that the information was intentionally suppressed. And so they were sued by saying whatever they said, right? We all know that the Tannerman sighting turned out to be a bogus lead as well. We also know that the Tannerman sighting was actively endorsed by the Tapas, certain members of the Tapas 7, and a lot of them were saying, you know who we think the Tannerman guy was? We think it was Robert Murat. And so there was this huge diversion for a long time where Robert Murat actually became a suspect based on these, in inverted commas, witness reports. And what is all of this sort of driving at? What is all of this attention on Robert Murat and on the abductor walking away from apartment 5A in the direction of Murat's home, in the direction of the east in terms of the Ocean Club? What is all of that all about? Well, wasn't it to distract attention from the other sighting, known as the Smithman sighting, which was on the west side, which was at the same time on May 3rd at night, in the sort of window period when Madeleine was supposed to have been abducted. And, Detective Amaral said, if you were going to leave on foot, why wouldn't you go that way, where it was darker, where it was less, there were less people, it was less populated, where there was more cover in terms of not just the cover of darkness, but also the urban fabric sort of dissipates quite quickly as you go to the west, whereas when you go further east it doesn't. There are just more apartments that way. So was this a accidental misdirection or a purposeful misdirection? I want you to keep that thought in the back of your minds as we go into Kate's narrative, and then what we're going to do is juxtapose that with Detective Amaral's narrative. Okay. So very broadly speaking, when we look at the graphs or maps or illustrations in Kate McCann's book, and I want to start with the broadest sort of illustration on at 19% in a book. You basically have a depiction of prior deluge, obviously from kind of above, and in that depiction, the a kind of a rectangle denoting Baptista supermarket is sort of how can I put it? It's kind of stamped over the area where the Smithman sighting was supposed to have happened, right? So instead of having any sort of information about where the Smithman sighting is, that entire aspect is kind of obscured by this rectangle, which is the largest rectangle of all of the rectangles showing the various places. And you've also got to ask yourself, why on earth wouldn't you show the Baptista supermarket? In other words, put the rectangle on the other side. Why wouldn't you do it there where there was no urban fabric? For example, sort of where the beach is or where the ocean is. Why wouldn't you do it that way? Why cover up that really important part of the urban fabric with that big box, right? And why not have it just say Baptista or supermarket? Why are both words there, making the box even bigger? So that's the first thing to note, and you might say, I think you're nitpicking it, it's really not a big deal. It's just a map of prior deluge, right? And I'm not going to show it because I don't want to have any copyright thing going on here. You can go and look at the thing in a book if you've got a book, otherwise just take my word for it. Now, I much prefer the image that's before that, which you see at 12%. And what I love about that image is it nicely slices the view of prior deluge, in terms of the Ocean Club. It sort of slices it off so that the entire Smithman route, the entire that section is just nicely cut off. There's no it's almost like the writer of the book wants you to pay attention to the Ocean Club and everything to the east of the Ocean Club, if that makes sense, right? It is directing your attention to the Millennium Restaurant. It's directing your attention to all the little bits of urban fabric to the east of the Ocean Club. And everything to the west of the main road running down the Ocean Club is just not represented, it's just not there, right? So it's kind of saying, look this way, right? Which is basically, in terms of the Tannerman sighting, it's saying, look at that. In other words, not acknowledging even the Smithman sighting, but it's done in kind of a subtle way. And then there's the illustration of the apartment 5A, and that is at 11% in the narrative. And even that is drawing your attention to the roads on the left-hand side, basically where the Tannerman sighting happened. When I say left-hand side, I'm referring to the east, right? It just shows the east side of the Ocean Club and the roads on the east, to the east of the Ocean Club. That's it. And then a final thing I want to just draw your attention to while we're on the topic of maps, and this is still in Kate McCann's book, is when you look at the map at 2% of the Iberian Peninsula and the Algarve, it shows a highlighted box of the area where the McCann stayed, It shows Praia de Luz, Lagos, Portimao, and Faro, and all the sort of important areas of the Algarve. But there's something missing on that map. And what is missing is, why is there no reference to Sagres, which is where we know the McCanns drove on several occasions, just not on the map. Sagres is right next to Praia de Luz. It's quite an important tourist center, and it's the last stop on the way to Cape St. Vincent, and that's also not identified on the map. Why would you identify Albufeira, Faro, Portimao, Lagos, Praia de Luz, and then nothing to the west? And once again, you have Praia de Luz, the words going over the west, as if so that you're not really going to be thinking about anything to the west. Oh, I think Praia de Luz is the last little town on the west side of the Algarve. Well, it's not. So that is just the graphics in Kate McCann's book. Now we're going to deal with the references to the word Smith, Martin Smith. Is Martin Smith mentioned in Kate McCann's book? And if you do a Google search for the name Smith, it doesn't come up at all. If you do a Kindle search for Martin, that's the first name of Martin Smith, the patriarch of the Irish family that saw someone in the alley. If you do a Kindle search for Martin, there are 21 matches, and they are for Rua Francisco Gentil Martins, which comes up a couple of times, and then there's also the rugby player Martin Johnson and PC Martin Grime, and that's about it. There's no reference to Martin Smith. So hold on, is there no reference to the Smith sighting in Kate McCann's book? Well, there are 9 references to the very broad word Irish. And it refers to, the first instance is to Gerry's Irish roots, I guess working class Catholic family with Irish roots. So that's not to the Irish family in Drogheda, the Smiths, it's not a reference to them. The second one is born to Irish parents in Glasgow, so that's also not a reference to the Smiths. Then there's another reference to British and Irish, I guess, and then another one. Oh, and then our first reference specifically to these people is where there's a reference to child reported by the Irish holiday makers in Rua da Escola. So that is a reference to the Smith sighting, and that is at location 76% into the narrative. So way after everything has been established through the Tannerman nonsense, while that's been established early on in the narrative, there's a sort of a glimpsing, by the way, reference to Irish holiday makers who saw something. And what is very interesting in Kate McCann's narrative is she sort of says, she refers to there being skepticism about an unexplained time lapse between the two sightings. And she says the similarities between she doesn't call it the Smith sighting, but the one sighting and the other are more significant to her than the discrepancies in timing. So she's kind of saying, weren't these sightings the same thing? Wasn't the Smith sighting or wasn't the one sighting and the other sighting, wasn't it the same sighting, right? And when she mentions the Irish holidaymakers, she jumps back to Jane Tanner's description. So she's kind of saying, oh, now that we're thinking about the Smith sighting, let's talk about Jane Tanner again. In other words, the Tanner sighting becomes, it sort of dominates, it kind of covers over the Irish, the Smith sighting once again. And very interesting that although there were so many people who saw, let's call it Smithman, Kate McCann doesn't ever identify them by name. She doesn't identify Martin Smith or any of the people that he was with, right? And she says, I'm staggered by how alike they are, almost identical, the two sightings. And she says, who knows why there was a 45-minute gap between the two sightings? Who knows what this abductor was doing in between that? And then she even says, I long ago stopped trying to come up with answers. In other words, she's saying, in terms of this other sighting, I've just stopped thinking about it. I'm not really going to try and solve this mystery. If the child was Madeleine, why would this guy be? In other words, she's not really trying to figure it out. She's saying, there's nothing normal about what was going on, so why try to figure it out, right? And then she kind of goes on to conflate Robert Murat with this as well, and again she sort of emphasizes that their friends' accounts of seeing him near the apartment led to her thinking a certain way. But can you see how the Smith sighting is conflated with Tannerman and with Robert Murat? And this is the part that some people don't know, is that the Smiths knew Robert Murat, and they said, the guy that we saw, we, plural, definitely wasn't Robert Murat. And that's something that's also not acknowledged here, that surely you can allow a witness to give their own testimony without interpreting it. And that is what's happening here. Robert Murat himself has an alibi, his own mother. His mother said that she was with him in the kitchen that night. And that was re-established during the 10-year anniversary when BBC's Panorama interviewed him and his mother and I think his aunt. And regardless of that, you had other people saying, no, I definitely saw him. And of course, these other people were members of the Tapa 7. And also, another member of the Tapa 7 said, yes, I saw a Tannerman. I saw this guy walking a certain way. And that guy then came forward and said, no, it was me, Dr. Totman. And what's really interesting with that is if Gerry had seen Dr. Totman or Jez had seen Dr. Totman, surely they would have said, that's the guy I play tennis with. And so in the Tannerman scenario, Gerry and Jez don't see him. And so the Totman thing misled the authorities. Again, the question is, accidentally or purposefully, for 5 years? And what could they have been or should they have been paying attention to in the absence of Tannerman? Well, the Smith sighting, of course. And in the 9 News coverage from the Australian 9 News, they talk about, is the Smith sighting the key to solving this case? And I'll talk to you guys a little bit more about that in the next episode. Coming back to Kate's book, as I said, there are 9 matches for the word Irish. The first 3 are irrelevant. The 4th refers to Irish holidaymakers, so that's 1. Then there's Irish witnesses. I think it's on the same page, so that's 2. And then all the others are, the next reference is to Rutland Irish Golf Society, so that doesn't count. And then you've got to go, for the next reference, you've got to go right to the back of the book where it's referring to references in the book in terms of the, I guess the index. And so that's referring back to those earlier references. So those references don't really count either. And so ultimately there are basically 2 references in the entire book to the Smith sighting or the Smith family. 2, that's it. Okay. Jane Tanner is referred to 10 times, and there are several references to Jane Tanner's sighting and child seen by Jane Tanner at 9:15, and man Jane Tanner saw carrying a child, and Jane Tanner witness, and so on. And the man seen by Jane Tanner was eventually made public 3 weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, right? This is when it's still within the ruse of that it was actually a legitimate sighting. Dr. Julian Totman isn't referred to anywhere in Kate McCann's book, and there's been ample opportunity for the McCanns to update the narrative, and yet they haven't. They've allowed the outdated narrative with what I think is a little bit misleading information. I mean, Tannerman turned out not to be illegitimate, so why not say that? Why allow the legacy narrative to continue? Why not change it? Now, I could be wrong. Maybe I've got an outdated version of the book, and maybe it has been updated without my knowledge. If it has, please let me know, because I would like to know if it has been updated. If it hasn't been updated, then what do you think about that? At 86% of the way through the narrative, there's a table comparing witness 1 sighting to witness 2 sighting. Now, what's quite interesting is she doesn't identify it as Jane Tanner's sighting, but that is witness 1, or the Smith sighting, which is witness 2. She doesn't identify it that way. Instead, it's sort of all lost between the number of sightings. Witness 1 sighting, witness 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then it just becomes lost in the murk of the number of sightings, right? And in any event, witness 1 sighting, the Jane Tanner sighting, and witness 2 are juxtaposed. They happen on the same night. They happen at approximately 9:15 and 10 p.m. The street addresses are given. The age of the man given by Jane Tanner is 35 to 40. The witness 2 sighting is given as 34 to 35. The height of the man is given as 5'10", and that's identical. Hair is given as dark hair by the Tanner sighting, short brown by the other sighting. Clothing, beige trousers in both cases, and walking hurriedly in the case of witness 1. And interestingly, in the Smithman sighting mentioned here, there's nothing about him walking hurriedly. I was under the impression from what I heard that he was walking hurriedly. Where the Smithman sighting takes place is quite a steep downhill slope anyway, so it would be difficult not to walk quickly. The Smith sighting, which we will go into in the conclusion of this analysis, we'll look at the glimpse that the Smith family got and what they say. He certainly walked by quickly, and they also say that they greeted this man and the man didn't greet them back, and that made them immediately suspicious anyway. And what's also really interesting is the Smith family were able to identify the age of the child being carried to exactly 3-4 years old, because they had a member in their family that age as well, so they're able to say definitively this was a almost 4-year-old child, which is exactly the age of Madeleine. And and then also that her hands were hanging loosely at her side as if she was either deeply asleep or something else. Right, so there's probably more we can say about the narrative that Kate has produced regarding all of this. But let's go on to Goncalo Amaral's narrative. And as one can expect, and bear in mind this is also a narrative that the McCanns opposed, that they didn't want his narrative in the public domain. They sued him, and as far as I know, his book still isn't available in the UK. I'm not really 100% about that. Is it possible to buy Amaral's book right now in the UK, or is it still whatever? I don't know what the word is. Is it suppressed? Is there kind of some kind of legal injunction against it? But I guess it's fair to say there's some opposition from the McCanns to Amaral's book. Is that fair to say? I don't know. Whatever it is, one can kind of anticipate them not being too friendly to Amaral because of what he suggests in the book. Compared to Kate's book, you actually have this person, the other witness, identified. Martin Smith's name comes up 12 times, right? And let's go through those references. So the first reference is the Smiths from Ireland, and he's referring to around about 9:27 at the Dolphin restaurant, and in fact he has an entire chapter dedicated to the Smith sighting, which is chapter 8. He talks about the Smiths don't see the face of the little girl whose arms hang by her sides. And this situation of a man carrying a child whose arms are by her side hanging limply suggests that this could be a dead child, it could be a drugged child, but it's certainly not a child that is awake and if this child is awake and it's a stranger abductor, why isn't she crying out? On the other hand, if something has happened to Madeleine, is that why this child's arms are hanging by her sides? And that was a fascinating insight, that there's this sense of lifelessness from the child that is being carried. They go on to describe the color of the pajamas, which are a match. The color of the hair, which is a match, and then the man wearing cream-colored or beige trousers. Now, what's fascinating is that the Tannerman sighting presents a man that's similarly dressed. Isn't that fascinating? That whatever this person was wearing, that could be a legitimate sighting, there's now someone else who's dressed kind of the same way. Couldn't it be him? And let's give that person walking the other way all of our attention, right? Then there's also the fact that this guy's a white guy, is aged around 30 to 35, and basically fits the profile of certain individuals, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, at the time, according to Amaral, Robert Murat was considered to be the main suspect. And when the Smiths returned to Ireland, they continued to follow the case, and then they heard that, according to Jane Tanner, Murat is definitely the man they encountered on the night of the abduction. And as a result of that accusation, it seems that the Smiths then really decided to get in touch. So unfortunately, they didn't get in touch anyway. They kind of responded to this other accusation, and then they got in touch with Irish police to say what they saw on the night of May 3rd. And Mr. Smith said categorically that the man they came across with a little girl in his arms wasn't Robert Murat. And he said he knows, is sure of this because he knows him. At the same time, this person says he's convinced that the little girl was definitely Madeleine. Now, you might say, well, why didn't this guy come forward earlier? You know, why did it take him a week or 2 weeks or whatever to come forward? For starters, you had the people very close to the case, the McCanns, the Tapa 7 and so on, insisting that it's Robert Murat, insisting that they saw a guy right there. And so I guess Mr. Smith thought, okay, well, they know what's going on. They've got, they're on track. They've got things going in the direction that they wanted to go. He's not going to interfere. The thing that's really interesting is Jane Tanner doesn't see the child. She just sees the feet of the child, whereas the Smiths see quite a lot. They see the child's hair. They see how the child's arms are hanging, and they see the full length of the child, and they're able to guess the child's age. And so they're saying that they're very sure that had to be Madeleine. Now, bear in mind, also a lot of the early photos that were released of Madeleine weren't accurate photos. And one's also got to ask that is, did someone not want some other witness to recognize the abductor and Madeleine? Was there someone who said, let's put out confusing photos so that the actual witness, possibly the actual witness, can't identify or is confused? How's that for a possibility? And I want to address this whole question of, can't we give these people the benefit of the doubt and just say, well, look, because of the dim lighting, maybe they made mistakes, right? And this is my response to that. I was in Praia de Luz last year on the 3rd of May. I recreated the abduction route at the time that it happened. And when I was done, I was walking around the back of the Ocean Club, basically where the tennis courts are. I was walking there just after 10 p.m. at night, and I recognized Martin Brunt while I was walking. And so in other words, I recognized somebody at night during the same scenario, and Martin was basically probably about 50 meters away from me, right? And I've never met Martin Brunt in person. I've never spoken to him directly. I've just seen him on TV. I just had a vague idea of what he looked like. And I went home and I made a note in my diary, and I said, I think I saw Martin Brunt out there doing God knows what while I was doing what I was doing. And interestingly, he turned his back and he walked away and got into his car. And I made a note that night, and I thought, well, you know, that's what I saw. And the very next day, I actually saw him reporting in front of the Ocean Club, so I knew that what I'd seen in the dark was accurate. It wasn't my imagination, and it wasn't so dark that I couldn't see. So the same applies to the Smiths, doesn't it? And so this is probably the reason that the McCanns aren't thrilled about Amaral's book. Is in chapter 20, he refers to an Irish family in a state of shock, and he refers to the Smiths are in Ireland. This is now jumping to September. The Smiths are watching BBC News, and they're broadcasting the return of the McCanns now as suspects. They've just been formally announced as suspects by the Portuguese police, and shortly after that they leave Portugal. And as they're coming out of the aeroplane, the Smiths see, wow, that's the guy we saw in the alley. And it's not just what they recognize is the way he's carrying the child, the way he's walking, and the way he's sort of looking away. And according to Amaral, Mr. Smith thinks he's hallucinating. But at that moment he's sure, according to Amaral, according to Smith, that the man they came across that night was Gerald McCann. And this is a quote from his book. And he goes on to say that there's very little doubt. And he's so convinced by this that he calls the police immediately. So it's not as though he sees something and he's like, I don't know, and nothing happens. He's so shocked by what he sees that he immediately reaches out to the police. And Amaral says, when they received this information at the end of September, so about 2 weeks later, they think, wow, okay, looks like they might be making a breakthrough here. They may have some critical evidence. And he's quite kind of sarcastic. He says, now we have a better understanding of why Jane Tanner, in inverted commas, sent the alleged abductor in the opposite direction, right? So what he's suggesting here, what Amaral, the former lead detective, is suggesting here is that Jane Tanner may have misdirected the investigation. I don't know whether he's saying intentionally or accidentally, but he's certainly bringing that thought to the fore, isn't he? He talks about suspicion that had to be diverted from Gerald. This is a quote from Amaral. He's saying suspicion had to be diverted from Gerald, who would have taken this route, and I was referring to the Smithman route. We did not go east but west in the direction of the beach. In other words, west towards the coast, away from the Ocean Club. And from there, the Portuguese police decide to get the Smiths back to the Algarve. They want a formal identification of Gerry McCann. So the police want to do a formal identification, but not with Gerry McCann in person, but using televised images, and because they say a direct confrontation is impossible, probably because is it going to be possible to get Gerry to come back to Portugal? Are they going to have to extradite him? So they're going to do some kind of formal identification using photos or images or something. And then what happens? Wow, the Smiths never come back to Portugal. The decision to delay the process, there's a decision to delay the process, and the Smiths aren't interviewed until several months later. Wow, so much for this urgent investigation, leaving no stones unturned. What do the McCanns say about this? What do the McCanns say about, hey, someone has thought they saw Madeleine, and they also thought they saw Madeleine's dad. What do you guys think about that? That doesn't seem to ever happen. There doesn't seem to be ever any response to that, or even any acknowledgement of that. Weird, hey? It's kind of just like a black hole, that particular aspect of the information. And then Amaral talks about rumors start circulating that people not involved with the investigation would be made aware of the existence of this witness. So suddenly other people then become aware of the Smiths, and then they contact the Smiths and something happens. I need to confirm this, but as far as I know, it was that one millionaire dude who was sort of a kind of conducting his own kind of informal investigation, and I think with his son. And as far as I know, didn't they then contact the Smiths and kind of like, almost like, okay, we investigating, and then the Smiths kind of, as I understand it, they then I don't want to say trust, but they kind of give their statements to these people, and then it just kind of disappears, right? Because the question is, are these investigators independent, or are they McCann investigators? And if they independent, surely that information would then come to light, and something would come as a result of it. But what if it was something else? Would you then expect information to come to light? Whatever the answer is to that, the answer is the information just kind of disappeared, and the Smith sighting faded into kind of mystery. And so, in terms of the chronology of Amaril's book, what's really interesting is you have this thing where the Smith sighting kind of flares up again. It's like, oh yes, that person we saw, and then the very next chapter is Amaril being dismissed. So you can see there's a clear battle between the narratives of Kate McCann and Amaril. The one hardly acknowledges the Smith sighting and won't even utter the word Smith. It's almost like Voldemort in Harry Potter. He who shall not be named. You're not even going to refer to it. And then in Amaril's book, there's a reference to it, and then Smith kind of goes off the radar, and so does Amaril. Amaril is kind of dismissed off the case at the same time. And you can say, well, that's fine. That's fine. There was another sighting, but then what happened to that sighting? It turned out to be a hoax. And we're going to go. The plot gets a lot thicker. We're going to go into the Smith sighting in the next episode, dealing with how the Netflix documentary deals with it. We're going to deal with the media narrative, how the media narrative deals with it. We're going to deal with how the official, in inverted commas, police narrative deals with it. And I'm not talking about Amaril, I'm talking about the other police investigation, the real investigation into Madeleine's disappearance, in inverted commas, of course. And then we're going to finalize this whole joke narrative around. We're going to go to Martin Smith and see what he actually said, what statement he made. Not only what statement did he make, but what statement did his family members make. And we're going to look at that. And then finally we're going to look at the 10-year anniversary panorama documentary, and something really, really intriguing that happened in that documentary regarding the Smith sighting. And we're going to deal with that in the episodes following this. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe to this channel. Watch this space for future episodes. Bear in mind my book, where I follow the abductor route via the Smith sighting, which is key evidence. My book is out on Amazon. It's Deeper into Darkness. It's available on Amazon right now. And I took photos and in situ, and I put a heck of a lot of links to the various images to explain to you exactly where I was, how long it took, the distance from A to B, how long it took to get from A to B, and then also how long it took to get back, and all of that is provided in that narrative, along with some other insights and investigations. So if you're interested, check that out. It's Deeper into Darkness, available just on Amazon Kindle. Thank you for listening. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe, keep up that social distancing, and I'll see you guys next time.